Good morning, everybody. Is this working? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me okay at the back? Okay, I'm very honoured and delighted to be part of this conference. And this first session, I think, will set us well into the rest of the day, because this is where we're looking at the overall history of the wonderful 70 years of struggle by UNRWA. It's a very special moment, not because of the 70 years only, but because, as Arafat just reminded us, Palestinians are in a particular time because of the current United States policy of attempting to delegitimize everything to do with Palestine, and that, of course, includes UNRWA and the cutting of its budget. I think in the last few months, as we saw decisions by the Americans on Jerusalem, on the Golan Heights, and most recently on settlements and the attempts to delegitimize the West Bank as it stands, it's as though they can't find enough things to try to delegitimize Palestine. And as the first speaker so movingly talked about, UNRWA has been over all these decades, and particularly with its schools, has been such an identity-forming experience for so many, many Palestinians. So I welcome all these wonderful former UNRWA people that we have with us today. I just want to mention one person who, of course, is not with us today, but I think is a symbol of how increasingly difficult it is to function as not only UN bodies in Palestine, and particularly in Gaza, but also for all NGOs. You'll all be familiar with the World Vision having to cut 120 jobs in Gaza, putting 40,000 kids unable to access the aid they were having before. And I think that the current 3-year campaign against Mohammed el-Halabi is something we need to bear in mind, because it just symbolizes how, for the lengths that will be gone to try to prevent solidarity and action for Palestinians. So now I want to hand over to our first speaker, who you all know very well, Dr. now Ambassador Husam Zomlot, who's had such a very distinguished career already, not only as an academic, but also in his rather titanic struggle to operate as the Palestinian representative in America. He managed as brilliantly as anybody possibly could, but I think at a great price to his family. And we particularly are happy and want to welcome him here in London. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Victoria, for this moving introduction. And I tell you, my family is happy in London, and we have President Trump to thank for being relocated to the UK. And good morning, everybody. Sabah al-khair, assalamu alaikum. I am particularly honored and thrilled to be among such distinguished panelists, Karen and Rachel. And may I start by really extending our heartfelt gratitude for you, for UNRWA, for all the service. I remember your work in Gaza and beyond, and meeting you, Karen. And your presence here means a lot to us. And let me say how pleased I am and honored to be speaking to you today at this very, very important occasion alongside the esteemed speakers. And also thank the Palestine Return Center, very good friends and long defenders of the right of return here in the UK and beyond. And of course, with the University of Exeter, and the European Center for Palestine and the Al Jazeera Research Center for organizing this timely conference. The issue of refugees, as everyone knows here, goes to the very, very heart of the Palestinian cause. The Palestinian cause began with the forced displacement and dispossession of around 2/3 of our nation, and losing 2/3 of our land in 1948. That is the origin of the cause of Palestine. This process of forced exile, displacement, dispossession is ongoing until this very moment. Just last week, Israel has declared that it has approved a law, between two parentheses, to annex big parts, swaths of the occupied West Bank. And it was and continues to be a deliberate, since 1948, colonial process of displacement and replacement, as our good friend Professor Elam Papi accurately described. But let me say this right from the beginning. There will be no resolution to our struggle without a resolution to the origin of the issue, that is the plight and the rights of the Palestinian refugees. And such a resolution must see the refugees able to fulfill and enjoy their rights, including the right of return. Some describe this right as an impossible issue to resolve, some in Israel, of course, with some of their international friends. Let's be clear. For us, this is both a collective and an individual right. My father, Saeed, was born in a beautiful town by the name of Simsim, in the south of Palestine, near Asqalan. In 1948, my father lost his home, his land, and as a result, I was born in the Rafah refugee camp to the very south, in the beautiful Rafah, to the very south of Gaza. And there is a story why I was born there, because my father and grandfather, as they were trying to protect their family from the shelling and the killings of 1948, my grandfather kept asking, "Are we still in Palestine?" And they would answer him, "Yes." At one point he asked, "Are we still in Palestine?" They said, "Yes," his colleagues, his friends. "But if you step one step, you will be in Egypt. There I was born." So he wanted us to stay in Palestine. But let me first make a rather downcast observation, Karen. It is a testament to human failure, our and others' failure, that we are today talking about UNRWA at 70. Just think about what it means. 70 years of refugee camps, of refugee status, of enforced temporary refugee existence. Millions remain stateless and homeless and targeted. Millions, these 7 decades later, suffer the most precarious existence of them all, that of exile. Nothing is more hurtful to a human being than exile, forced exile. Millions are denied their basic right to return home and to live in freedom and self-determination. That is a failure. It is ours and it is the world's. That said, I of course have to commend UNRWA. Like what we just heard from the director of PRC, their work has been tireless and crucial. It has not only kept people alive, but offered them education, opportunities, livelihoods, a chance of betterment. Perhaps most importantly, some hope in this dark time is really giving all these refugees an opportunity. Let me use myself as an example. Upon graduation from AbuZayd University in the mid-90s exactly, my first and only choice was to join the United Nations because of exactly what we just heard. Because our life as refugees was all about the blue flag, the 4x4 jeeps, the UN schools, the UN flag flying all over our camps. I grew up with a semi-permanent roof blowing above our heads in a temporary homes. Every day I would see the UNRWA service to all of us, all my generation, all the kids, the children in the schools, in the hospitals, the clinics. And my generation grew up really to look up to, respect, associate ourselves with your service, with your mission, with UNRWA, with the UN. I'm just one of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians of my generation upon which UNRWA left its mark. We have grown up, some of us, to be the voices and representatives of our nation. Some of us have become the professors, the doctors, the geniuses of the IT. All that thanks to UNRWA. UNRWA has been among the most effective investments in human history. This year, UNRWA educates around 500,000 Palestinian kids, children. These 500,000 children will also grow up to be the voices of their generation and to be a force of good for their nation and other nations. And my friends, UNRWA and the care and the support for Palestinian refugees in particular, and refugees in general, is an international moral and legal obligation. We, the Palestinians, did not choose to be refugees. We do not want to be refugees. We cannot wait for the time when we are no longer refugees. UNRWA's continued existence is a manifestation of the international community's commitment to and responsibility under international resolutions on the Palestinian refugee issue and on the Palestinian issue in general. And yet today the political narrative has become so hostile that even this responsibility of caring for refugees until their rights are upheld and implemented, even that is under attack. Even the commitment to uphold international responsibility and care for refugees is being questioned. We have regressed so much in the last few years, thanks to the Trump administration, that we are not talking about the lack of international will to implement the rights of the refugees. We are only attacking the international responsibility to care for them until that will comes about. This is absolutely not right. Refugees everywhere have been a force of good. Even in the US that is orchestrating this attack. The US was built, by the way, by refugees. And we are now labeled as refugees by various Israeli politicians and officials as a demographic threat. That's the whole political discussion about refugees. And let's once and for all challenge this evolving narrative. The idea that we are somehow exceptional as Palestinians. Only Palestinians as refugees are a threat, a demographic threat. There are international standards, and my colleagues here in the panel know this best about the rights of refugees in general, what happened in Kosovo and the Balkans and everywhere else. Why we are always made the exception? We owned our homes. My father did own his home. We owned our farms. We lived in our villages for hundreds and hundreds of years, for millennia. We are one of the most ancient nations, if not the most ancient nation. The oldest human community is in Jericho. And therefore, we shall not be the exception. We have a right to go back to our homes, and we will. There is a narrative that is being pushed by the current American administration under President Trump that UNRWA perpetuates the right of return. That's why they have cut their funding to UNRWA, that it was a direct attack, not on UNRWA as an organization, but on our rights. And the narrative originates from Benjamin Netanyahu, publicly, saying that UNRWA keeps the talk, the discussion about the right of return. I have this to say to both Trump and Netanyahu. Refugees' rights, our rights, have nothing to do with the existence of UNRWA or an organization. We commend, we vow, and we will continue working with UNRWA. But our right of return is not associated with an organization. Our right of return, our national rights and individual rights are kept alive by our own insistence on our rights. We do so first of all because we have an agency as Palestinians, and we have pride. We keep our identities alive, our culture, our heritage alive, our history, our oral history, our written history, in every sphere of life, in every corner of every refugee camp. And many of you know this very well. We know where we came from. We know our homes in Jaffa and Haifa and Asqalan, and in the hundreds of villages that have been since destroyed. We remember how we got to where we are now. We know what happened in 1947 and 1948. We know in details, and we tell our children. We do not forget. This is why the right of return is alive, and it will continue being alive. Come and ask my son Saeed, who's 8 years old, where are you from? He will immediately tell you, I am from Simpson. He has not seen Simpson, but he knows that is the origin of his father and his grandfather. And I know this goes for every Palestinian refugee, every and each Palestinian refugee. The only thing that is preventing a resolution is not our definition and our defiance, nor the clarity of international law. It is Israel's insistence that the Palestinians alone among the nations do not have the right to return to the lands and homes from where they were forcibly uprooted. Let me fast forward very quickly by saying that this whole attack on UNRWA has been serious. I was in Washington when the attack started. It was very serious. And it was meant to actually see the end of that organization. To cut $300 million in one go instantly was meant to actually dismantle the organization at once. Today we stand and the organization is with us. UNRWA is with us, kicking and screaming and still giving opportunities and life to hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. Thanks to the world. You saw only last week or the week before the resolution on UNRWA. While the US was trying to isolate UNRWA, isolate the Palestinian people, isolate the Palestinian leadership, UNRWA and the Palestinian people and the Palestinian leadership have managed to isolate the US. Only 2 voted against UNRWA in this world. 2. Guess? Yes, even Micronesia did not vote against UNRWA. And there can be no clearer rebuff of the Trump administration's policy on UNRWA than the United Kingdom. Not only did not follow suit, it doubled its contribution. This year, in 2019, the UK contributed £65.5 million, compared to £33.5 million only last year. We thank the government and the people of the UK for this very principled position. The attack on UNRWA is, of course, nothing more and nothing less an attack on the people of Palestine. The US has clearly decided to end the Palestinian issue, to liquidate our rights, and is engaged in a multi-pronged attack. I'm not going to go through the list. You know what happened. The first decision was to close our mission to Washington in November 2017. That was a direct decision to de-recognize the Palestinian peoplehood, collective rights, representation, followed by cutting funding to UNRWA, followed by cutting funding to the Palestinian Authority, to the civil society, followed by the decision on Jerusalem, followed by the decision on the Golan Heights, and all the way to only a couple of weeks ago, that settlements are not inconsistent with international law. How shameful, disgraceful. And as such, Israel now has the guts to actually stand in the daylight and tell all of us in the eye that it will annex territory, occupy territory. As such, we have the Minister of Interior Security only a few days ago by the name of Naftali Bennett saying that not only we will kill Palestinians with impunity, but we will not return their bodies. How sick is that? How sick is that? It's this law we have arrived at. I mean, you know, all these years of killing with impunity and violating the very basic international rules is something. And then depriving families of burying their loved ones has nothing to do with politics and narrative. It's sickness. Now, at no point this administration has been willing to respect Palestinian rights, international resolutions, and that's why, my friend Arafat, we decided to boycott this administration, to have a policy of no contact with the administration. We do not engage in international relations only because we want to talk. We engage in international relations because it advances our national rights. Indeed, and here I will be concluding, I just want to say that the US administration ultimate plan is nothing but a real estate deal, because I was there, I was a foot soldier, just a real estate deal. You know how real estate business goes in New York? Somebody gets the property and somebody gets the cash. So the Trump and his team decided that Israel gets the property, gets it all, wins all, and we get some cash. Well, that's one side of it. And we have told them, and maybe this is an opportunity to tell them again, I mean, come on, we are not for sale. We are not for sale. And we can offer you cash if this is really what you are about. But number two, which is much more dangerous than the first, and by the way, number one explains to you the whole Bahrain workshop, the Kushner Bahrain workshop. Because the mindset of this administration is that we, the Palestinian people, we have needs, not rights. We have needs. I'm not going to swear. It's life, I think. The second dimension of this administration is much more dangerous. It is almost, Friedman, the US ambassador to Israel, is on a religious mission. Do you remember the sledgehammer in his hand underneath the old city of Jerusalem, opening a tunnel, claiming that this tunnel was a tunnel for pilgrims 2,000-3,000 years ago? He is starting the Armageddon, the religious war, the religious conflict and confrontations, which we resist. We believe this is a political and legal issue that could be resolved. Now, let me just clarify our position and end here. We believe the two-state solution on the 1967 borders is an international responsibility because it was in the first place an international demand. By the way, it was never a Palestinian demand. It was a Palestinian concession. This two-state solution includes these two most important items. First is the end of Israel's occupation that began in 1967 and the creation of a sovereign, independent state of Palestine on the 1967 borders, not based on the 1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as its capital. That's number one. Number two, the full respect and implementation of the right of return and compensation for Palestinian refugees in accordance with UN Resolution 194. One does not and will not come at the expense of the other. May I repeat this? One does not and will not come at the expense of the other. Those who have the illusion that we will be focusing on the state, not the refugees, or the refugees are not the state, are mistaken. This is the formula. This is the maximum we could have offered the world, and the minimum we will accept. Yesterday was the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. Only yesterday, the 29th of November. We take our strength first and foremost from our people, our nation. But also, we take it from our friends, our international friends, our Arab brothers and sisters, from the international community and the people of the world. This is our cause, but it is also the world's. This is not just about justice for Palestinians. After all, what does justice for Palestinians mean, if not simply justice for all? Justice for Palestinians is justice for all. And I remember Martin Luther King saying that injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. That is why we see the Palestinian flag now flying everywhere. I wish you were with me in Sheffield only a few weeks ago, and seeing that genuine love and identifying with the people and the flag of Palestine. We see the flag flying everywhere, not only in Sheffield, everywhere, in the UK and beyond, because our flag is no longer just ours. It is, and it has become a symbol for the struggle for justice everywhere. That gives me hope. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Zomlot. Very comprehensive. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce Karen AbuZayd, who is like the epitome of the international civil servant at the service of people. She was 20 years in UNHCR, and she worked in Sudan, Namibia, West Africa, the Sierra Leone, Liberian Civil War. Then she was in Bosnia in the worst 4 years of the Bosnian War in Sarajevo. And then she was the Palestine person that, for many of us, I first met her in Gaza more years ago than I care to remember, but anyway, a long time ago. And she ended by being Mrs. UNRWA. Having been the deputy, she then became the head of UNRWA. And I think everybody who ever worked with her or who knows about UNRWA's work during those years be very, very happy to hear her speak to us about that time. Thank you, Karen.
Well, thank you. And I think we've heard already beginnings of all the political side of things represented very well by the speakers, and that will be continuing. And so I'm going to go soft and talk to you about my 10 years in Gaza with the Gazans and the Palestine refugees. And I've actually chosen this subject as an opportunity to describe life under Israeli occupation in Gaza, and to acquaint others with the heroic Gazans with whom I lived and worked for 10 years, from 2000 to 2010. Their stories, indeed their lives, over decades have been ones of increasing hardship and threats with all the restrictions the occupation imposes. Repeated, sometimes deadly, conflict with the neighbor who engages without restraint, often violently, and an overall lack of freedom, including of movement beyond the borders of this 27 by 7 mile territory, resulting in the impossibility to enjoy or even live what could be termed elsewhere as normal life. Yet what one encounters in the territory is not under, when the territory is not under periodic, recurrent military threats from next door, is an appearance of normality. As Gazans go about their work, their schooling, even their recreation, with a determination and an attempt to face and overcome their hardships positively and with mostly good cheer. I recall my decade in Gaza with pleasure, sadness, and anger, as you will appreciate as I describe this period in Gaza. As was mentioned, for 5 years, 2000 to 2005, I served as UNRWA's Deputy Commissioner General under Peter Hansen's Commissioner Generalship. This was very important and much appreciated introduction to a refugee situation which was very different from those in which I had been involved since 1981 with UNHCR, mostly in emergency situations, in, as was mentioned, Sudan, Namibia, Sierra Leone, Bosnia, and South Africa. In 2005, on Peter's retirement, I became the Commissioner General, a post I held both gratefully and enthusiastically until 2010, when it became time for me to retire as well, however reluctantly. Having been in the field for most of my 20 years with UNHCR, working with other refugee populations meant being in the relatively safe places where refugees take refuge. For me, this was for the most part, excluding my assignment to Sarajevo during the war. I do not wish to suggest that Gaza was or is what most would describe as safe, but in relative terms, Palestine refugees in Gaza and the West Bank, which UNRWA also served from Gaza headquarters then, along with the Palestinians in Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, they lived at least partially under the authority, however challenged and dictated by the occupying power, of their own Palestinian administration, one in Gaza under Hamas and the other in West Bank under the Palestinian Authority, who has overall charge as well. This meant that the usual care and diplomacy needed to negotiate terms for those who took refuge in foreign lands were not the challenge they often are in the latter case. We had our supporters who were the government there. In Gaza, in particularly, and to a lesser extent in the West Bank, the refugees and UNRWA's challenges instead were with the arbitrary borders established and periodically reestablished by the occupying power, who made their own and ever-changing rules on when, who, what, how much, and how many could cross those borders. What I wish to convey is the disconcerting environment, which in many ways and times during the decade I'm describing appeared to be blatantly contradictory. Normal, on the one hand, since Palestine refugees in Gaza and the West Bank and Jerusalem were at least nominally, although only partially, heroically in charge of their own lives with the semblance of everyday activities under their own auspices, as is the case among non-refugees. I use those terms semblance and partial. This relates to the occupation, which is what it is, and oversight by this hostile neighboring occupier. One need only take note of the ever-increasing encroachment on Palestinian homes, historical and religious sites, their lands, which occurs on a regular basis. Almost daily in Jerusalem and the West Bank, today, often to the extent of destroying homes and farms and other properties and lives. While Palestinians in Gaza during the decade I described went about their lives, working, schooling, taking advantage of the beach along their very narrow strip of land, somehow like unoccupied citizens, there was always that looming shadow of recurring attacks, of constant prohibition of movement across the border for important things like medical care, accepting a scholarship abroad, visiting relatives in the West Bank or elsewhere, or simply having a holiday in a new location without the need to beg for permission, often declined. And keep in mind again that Gaza is a very small territory for 2 million people, 1.5 million of them Palestine refugees. Imagine a territory on the face of it ruled, but contradictorily, not controlled by its own elected government, with freedom of movement inside its externally defined territory, free speech to a certain extent, free choice to a much more limited extent, but confined within this narrow space where all of these freedoms, in fact, are determined, or at least affected, I could say dictated, by the same hostile neighbor. Life is very uncertain under such circumstances, and while Gazans make the best of it for the sake of their families, one can understand they often become very upset and very angry and wanting to protest when these very freedoms enjoyed by the occupiers are denied, and that explains the march to the border every week. Not only is individual travel subject to permission from next door, I use this phrase deliberately, as the activities of this controlling neighbor are there in plain sight all the time, but the amount of goods which allow a civilized life are also controlled to the calorie, the gallon, the yard, etc. Yet Gazans make the most of the opportunities offered to them. If granted permission, usually after multiple applications and long waits to cross the border for serious purposes, as I've mentioned already, medical, education, business, to visit ailing relatives, for example, there will still be interminable waits at the so-called border and a long trek by foot to reach the Israeli officer who's going to eventually open the gates and let you out. Again, this has become a tolerated way of life. What choice do they have right now? Grocers and shopkeepers who must apply for permission to bring limited supplies into their shops. Doctors in a hospital that do the same for their patients. Entrepreneurs who try to keep their businesses going, but always fearful of an ever more restricted list of permitted goods, of late deliveries, of last-minute refusals, including of previously approved goods that have arrived at the border. I could go on, but you get the picture. Trying to live what you believe, even know, as we've already heard, what is normal, but subjected to decisions you cannot protest or reject to allow that freedom of travel, decision, and demand, applying in a prescribed but dignified manner to be allowed to bring in medicines your relatives need, or the foodstuffs so that your grocery business can thrive, or the chance to leave Gaza for a scholarship, to visit these ailing relatives I've already mentioned, even in the West Bank, or to accept a job abroad. Surprising to me at first, and later simply a matter of respect and wonder, was the positive adaptation to living under occupation that most Gazans had, most of the time. How they kept a cheerful, or at least an uncomplaining attitude while facing this constant but unpredictable impositions on what must be considered normal elsewhere. Parents deserve enormous respect as they, again, outwardly, cheerfully, made sure their children were in school, impeccably dressed and totally prepared for each day, usually with smiles on their faces. Particular thanks are due to the teachers who met their responsibilities and meet their responsibilities as if they're living as normal teachers, unburdened by the specter of anything untoward or challenging that could occur at any time and had to be overcome while living under the edicts and interference of a hostile and powerful neighbor, and who determined how many and which books you could order, and how much paper and how many pens you and your students needed. So far, I've been describing life under the quiet times, not those when usually for reasons not easy to understand or comprehend, the violence would erupt in the form of aerial bombing from next door. Then all bets were off, as they say. Everyone hunkered down, hoping to avoid being wounded or losing a home or a farm or a relative. Events and the environment grew gradually more difficult during my decade in Gaza, and even more since I've left. More and more severe restrictions were imposed on the movement of people and goods, attacks that had been non-existent when I first arrived, when everyday life could be counted on to follow a certain restricted pattern. Throughout it all, however, Gazans stayed calm and carried on, if I may quote a slogan that pertains to other threatening but less threatening environments. This is more amazing, remembering from years ago how my staff, who, aside from a handful of dedicated expatriates, were almost entirely all Gazans, got up in the morning, they went to work, they did as much as they could, willingly, enthusiastically, to provide the education and health and other social services that UNRWA was empowered by the international community to offer to Gazans behind this artificially defined and observed border. Having endeavored to paint a realistic picture of Gaza and Gazans during the time, my relatively livable decade among them, I hope I've also conveyed my admiration and gratitude for how they showed and still show until today, God bless them, when conditions are considerably more difficult than then, that a beleaguered people can keep up their spirits, can get up each day to struggle with the difficulties imposed by an occupation, sometimes to the extent of causing injuries and deaths, always causing disappointment and frustration. If I may venture modestly to explain their spirit, I believe, we've heard some about it, we'll hear more, it's at least partially because they know their cause is just. They never forget or forgive or give up on the past or what they insist will be their future. Palestinians around the world, as we hear today, have shown great patience in holding on to their determination to have a state and a territory of their own under their full control, after these have been continually encroached upon and denied to them for decades. Still, they carry on around the world, but most seriously in the occupied territory, Gaza, the West Bank, and Jerusalem, and also in Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, standing firm, defending, and fighting for the legitimate goals for which they've been struggling for decades. Lucky and grateful am I for having been able to spend 10 years in the occupied territory, leaving reluctantly, but with a new inspired view of what life and family and home mean. And thanks to the spirit and the determination of the Palestinian people and the strength and righteousness of the Palestinian cause, I, with many others, continue to look forward to that day when justice will have its day in the Middle East and the Palestinians will live free. Thank you. I was going to say, since people were mentioning their families and their families' children's name and so on, the AbuZayd comes from my Sudanese husband, and my older son is named Yasser, and my younger son is Haitham. So.
Thank you so much, Karen. It's a wonderful tour d'horizon. Our third speaker is Rachel Evans, who is the director of the legal department of UNRWA. Luckily, she has a whole slew of degrees and international law experience, but I can hardly think of any other job in which being the legal chief would be so challenging as in dealing with Israel in this situation. Rachel, please.
So, distinguished guests, I'm delighted to be here in the company of all of you, including our former and most esteemed Commissioner General, Ms. Karen AbuZayd. This is indeed an honor for me. We haven't met, but I have heard so much about your legacy, and I respect you and salute you. UNRWA at 70 requires a necessary reflection, and I'm here on behalf of UNRWA to offer some humble perspectives on 70 years of existence, achievements, challenges, and outlooks. So I hope you'll bear with me. I'll try and stick to my 15 minutes, and it's hard to zone in on exactly what to say, but I have thought about what perhaps would be most useful for this audience. And I'm assuming you have quite a good knowledge of UNRWA, so I won't go into all of the underlying details, but I will remind all that we were mandated to meet humanitarian and human development needs of Palestine refugees pending a just and durable solution. Our continuing existence represents the ongoing needs that Palestine refugees have as a result of the lack of a political solution to their plight. Sometimes it's said that UNRWA prolongs the refugee problem. This is inaccurate. UNRWA exists as a function of the lack of a political solution and the continuing needs as determined by the General Assembly, our parent organ. Palestine refugees remain refugees for as long as their situation is not resolved. When the agency started to operate in 1950, it was responding to the needs of approximately 750,000 displaced Palestine refugees who settled where they could, thinking that displacement was temporary and that they would return soon. Many still hold the keys to their homes. Today, more than 5 million Palestine refugees are eligible for UNRWA services within the key areas of our operations. As you all know, our geographical mandate includes 5 fields, and the Near East, which is in our title. So Jordan, Lebanon, Syrian Arabic Republic, West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. Nearly 1/3 of Palestine refugees, more than 1.5 million individuals, are registered as living in 58 recognized refugee camps. The responsibility of the camps is limited for UNRWA in that we provide services, but we do not own, administer, or police the camps, which is the responsibility of the host governments. The remaining 2/3 of Palestine refugees live in and around the cities and towns of the host countries, and in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, often in the environs of the camps. While most of our installations and schools are located in the camps, a number are outside the camps. The agency Human Development and Humanitarian Services, as you know, encompass education, healthcare, relief, social services, camp infrastructure and improvement, microfinance, emergency assistance, including in terms of armed conflict. I won't go into detail on each of these services, but maybe some key statistics will assist you. For example, UNRWA provides free universal primary education to more than 500,000 refugee children. We have more than 711 schools, providing a measure of stability and perspective to these children. This contributes directly to their human rights and to ensure that they enjoy a measure of human dignity. We also have vocational centers and education science facilities. Health. We offer preventative and curative health services to approximately 3.1 million refugees through more than 140 health clinics. UNRWA Healthcare carry out about 8.5 million visits a year. This is a significant service. We provide relief and social services. Of the some 5 million Palestine refugees, it's estimated that 1.2 million live in absolute poverty. 700,000 of them live in abject poverty, unable to meet even the most basic of needs. We have a microfinance department, which is alive and kicking and an extremely interesting program, providing sustainable income-generating opportunities for Palestine refugees, as well as other poor and marginalized groups who live and work near them. We have provided to date more than 437,000 loans to assist, and in particular, the recipients of the loans, the majority of women, receive them with 100% repayment credibility. We have UNRWA camp and infrastructure programs which work towards a safe and healthy urban environment to Palestine refugees, whether it's to ensure safe drinking water, waste removal services, stormwater drainage, rodent control services, to avoid the combats of the spread of sanitation and hygiene-related diseases. We also provide shelter including through schools in emergency times. So some statistics here, because this is a real service. Our teachers in the day become shelter managers at night. For example, in the 2014 conflict, UNRWA housed over 300,000 displaced refugees in Gaza in its schools. We also provide emergency response. And here you have to imagine, again, our staff turn from teachers, doctors, sanitation laborers during the day to emergency response providers at night on the ground. UNRWA does not leave during crisis. It stays and it delivers. Protecting and promoting the lives and the human rights of Palestine refugees under international law is one of our core and prioritized functions. It safeguards and advances the rights of Palestine refugees through the direct provision of services and advocacy activities. We have been a strong advocate for the protection and promotion of the rights of Palestine refugees. This has included on the negative consequences of the occupation in the occupied Palestinian territories, the blockade on the Gaza Strip, the impact of the Syrian conflict on Palestine refugees, and we document alleged human rights violations, and we have a duty to bring these to the attention of the duty bearers and the international human rights system. Through protection interventions, UNRWA addresses the root causes of abuse and neglect of beneficiary rights and highlights the urgent need for a just and durable solution to the plight of Palestine refugees. And for this work, we are continually attacked. I thought it would be useful, because I knew Karen would be reflecting on the decade up to 2010, to consider regional and operational developments in our environment in the decade between 2010 and now, to give some understanding to the intense, challenging operating environment in which we operate, and to fully appreciate the sheer unsustainability of the situation of Palestine refugees in overall human terms, from social and economic perspectives to the dimension of human rights, security, and dignity. Trends over the last decade have become even bleaker. Over the last decade, it started with the so-called Arab Spring, which created a space and an opportunity for expression of civil and political rights. But it also produced challenges and dangers, political upheavals or unrest, which created tensions in all of our areas of operation. Refugees, in addition to the heavy burden of protracted and unresolved exile, are facing the challenges of this social and economic change. This has brought regional tensions, impediments to peace and sustainable development. So if we reflect on the proximity talks and the fragile hopes that it engendered when they were eclipsed by the tragic events on the high seas on the morning of the 31st of May, 2010. These events were a painful reminder of the nature of occupation of Palestine lands in general, and the closure of Gaza's borders in particular. And this particular event illustrated the dire consequences of the international community's collective failure to achieve a negotiated solution to the conflict and to enforce and ensure respect for international law across the region. We have seen global financial uncertainty, which cast a shadow on the economic prospects of major donor states, which constrain their capacity to respond to UNRWA's needs as generously and as urgently as the situation demanded. And in turn, we saw increasing pressure on UNRWA to streamline expenditure, maximize cost efficiencies, impacting the quality and breadth of our services, resulting in a regional anxiety about what do these trends mean and imply for the prospects of UNRWA's presence and role. Successive financial crises have plagued the agency over the last decade. In 2018, we faced the biggest challenge ever in the history of the agency following the defunding of our biggest donor, the United States, first by reducing their contribution by 300 million and then increasing this year by 360. This left us with a deficit of minus 446 million US dollars out of an operating budget of 1.2 billion. This was the greatest predicament, financial terms, facing the agency. And the convergence of this crisis with the lack of tangible progress in the political sphere, especially in respect of refugees, was extremely and remains extremely troubling. We saw the increasing risks of the size of the shortfalls. I was saying to Karen earlier when I was reflecting upon this speech and looking at through the old documentation, financial crisis has been a continuing element of UNRWA, but it has spiked and it is becoming more serious. And the possibility we faced and continue to face right now as we speak, with need to close the funding gap to the end of this year, was to postpone the opening of schools for our 530,000 children. And this is a serious stress for the community. Education through UNRWA is one of the most stabilizing factors in the region. Imagine 530,000 kids without education, with no alternative. The increasing sizes of the shortfalls and the risks were extreme and remain extreme. Since the 2010 conflict, or the consequences thereof, we are engulfed and all 5 areas of operations are impacted. We saw the outbreak of the Syrian conflict over this decade, where Palestinians who had long enjoyed a range of stable social and economic rights. For over 6 decades, these communities had created lives, raised families, developed livelihoods in a welcoming and relatively stable environment. However, they now face increasing poverty, growing insecurity, and further displacement, which have been devastating blows. We witnessed 2 significant conflicts in Gaza in 2012 and 2014. Focusing on 2014, let's remember the statistics, and I don't have the names with me of each of those who suffered. I tried to get them because UNRWA has a tradition of not just saying statistics without names. But in 2014, 1,500 civilians, including 538 children and 306 women, were killed. Some 1,500 children were orphaned. 11,000 people were injured, including 1,000 children who to this day remain with a variety of disabilities. This is what we faced in the last 10 years. And the real problems, as we've heard, underlying the crisis in Gaza remain unresolved. In particular, the many calls to end the illegal Israeli blockade remain unanswered. The population of Gaza, including more than 1 million Palestinian refugees, have no reason to envisage a better future than the one projected in the UN's Gaza 2020 report, which paints a bleak picture of the Strip's infrastructure, natural resources, economy, and people's welfare, and more disturbing, the epidemic deterioration in psychosocial conditions, creating the basis for catastrophic future developments. In 2010, we saw a bit of improvement in Lebanon, or at least we hoped for it, where there were potential laws amending the labor laws to provide employment opportunities for Palestinians. However, unfortunately, there's been no implementation of these amendments to date, and only this year we've seen further concerning developments in respect of announcements of restrictions on labor laws and permits for Palestine refugees. Without these opportunities, there is very little horizon, and Palestine refugees in Lebanon are some of the most vulnerable. They continue to live in some of the worst conditions of refugees in the region. This decade saw the 50th anniversary of the Israeli occupation of Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, the continuing blockade of Gaza, the illegal but relentless settlement expansion, continued to destroy the ability of Palestinians with any hope of building a productive and peaceful future. In the West Bank, we saw the familiar pattern of systematic violations of human rights, continued unabated, in spite of international appeals for Israel to stop creating facts on the ground that jeopardize the peace efforts. Overall socio-economic conditions in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, continue to deteriorate for Palestine refugees, with systematic restrictions on the movement of persons and their conduct of trade, causing widespread poverty and unemployment, including in the 19 refugee camps. In this decade, we saw the blockade become entrenched. As a direct consequence, poverty and food insecurity grew. UNRWA has a major responsibility for the welfare of 2/3 of the population of Gaza. And from that perspective, it's clear that Gaza over the last decade has become close to uninhabitable, and that further conflict, bound as before to affect civilians, will erupt unless its causes are addressed. The unsustainability in Gaza has been measured by the continued downward spiral that the population of the Strip is confronted with. Refugees needing food assistance. This statistic is shocking. In 2010, 80,000 Palestine refugees relied on food assistance. In 2019, it's over 1.1 million refugees relying on food aid from UNRWA. They have nowhere to go, and unemployment is over 50%. For the youth, it's over 65%, and for women, it's over 80%. These are people, by the way, who wish to work, who are educated, who have skills. These are people today receiving food assistance, who a few years ago ran factories and employed people, now relying on food baskets. Lebanon and Jordan continue to pay a heavy price for regional insecurity, and the conflict in Syria in particular. We use every opportunity at UNRWA to pay tribute to the hospitality of Lebanon and Jordan and emphasize the need of the international community to support both countries. As we heard, we saw the move of the US Embassy to Jerusalem that caused strong reactions and anxieties. We saw a rise in attempts, as we heard, to delegitimize UNRWA and Palestine refugees, including a recent announcement by the government of Israel of a policy to replace UNRWA services in East Jerusalem, contrary to international law, including the rights enshrined in the Fourth Geneva Convention. We saw the so-called Great March of Return, an extensive violence in already traumatized Gaza, with many killed and thousands injured. And this situation is greatly underestimated by the world. More people were injured in about 10 days of mostly peaceful demonstrations than during the 50-day attack and all-out war in 2014. Being exposed to danger and hardship has been the daily routine in this decade. Palestine refugees remain vulnerable, and this vulnerability increases, as happens with refugee communities all over the world when they are exposed to shock of conflict. But I must dwell for a moment on the broader challenges, and we heard some reference to them today. So funding challenge, I've expressed, it's clear. And with some exceptions, UNRWA relies on voluntary contributions. To perform our mandate, we need 1.2 billion a year. Our current deficit lies at 167 million, and we're in November. And that is a very restrictive budget. 167 million still means that we have to postpone vendor payments. We have to take SURF loans from the international OCHA facility, and so on. It's a very minimal amount and will not resolve all the issues. Okay. We've seen all kinds of other attempts to delegitimize UNRWA, and they were referred to today, whether it's the definition of Palestine refugees, the issue in relation to descendants, the offhand comment that it should be so easy to merge UNRWA and UNHCR without any absolute thought on the difference of the two agencies and the ridiculousness of that suggestion. We see attacks on the generational status when all refugees around the world pass status down to their descendants. We've seen protracted situations in Afghanistan, Angola, and all kinds of other countries. And the right of return, which is a fundamental right for all refugees, enshrines in GA resolutions. I'm being told I need to wrap up. I have too much to say, and perhaps during the day I can say more. What I would like to highlight, though, is during this decade, UNRWA has achieved monumental achievements that are not always heard because we're not very good at PRing ourselves. What we do is spend a lot of time reacting to the attacks, which are many. But we have made leaps and bounds in areas of cost efficiencies, in programmatic reforms in relief and social services, education and relief, or education and health systems. Our microfinance program has received endless awards. We have been innovative in our funding, seeking alternative solutions. Last year alone, more than 40 countries stepped up to the mark to bridge the funding gap. And if I may, with a short conclusion, why are we still relevant? We have 2 million students who have passed through UNRWA schools over the decades since 1950. We have, in the last decade, delivered 86 million medical consultations. We take 23,000 patients every day in our clinics. We provide shelter. We provide livelihoods. And I would like to conclude by reminding ourselves that the strength of UNRWA and its value to the international community are inextricably linked to the significance of refugees as a distinct constituency of the Palestinian body politic. We make an essential contribution to their well-being and dignity, and therefore enhance the value of Palestinian human capital. This is an organization that has seen a lot over 7 decades. It's seen the pain firsthand and the injustice. It has also seen achievements. And despite the extreme adversity, we are an agile, extraordinarily nimble, and resilient organization operating in one of the world's most polarized environments. At 70, we are an illustration of what can and in many ways has been achieved for Palestine refugees. But we are a living reminder of what happens when no political solutions are found to address the underlying causes of historic injustice. At the heart of dignity and the plight of Palestine refugees is an unresolved conflict, an ongoing occupation, and a lasting injustice. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Extremely comprehensive. I'm sorry I had to raise the red flag there. I would just like to take guidance from, shall we do the film now, although we're running so late? Yes. Okay, so now we have a short film from Canada, from Professor Michael Lynch, who, as you know, is the Special Rapporteur, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights, following Richard Falk. So we can play that now, please.
Good morning. It is my great pleasure and honor to have been asked to be part of this important and timely conference. For reasons that I will mention in a minute, UNRWA is an institution that is very close to my heart. First of all, may I beg forgiveness from all of you for not being able to join you in person as much as I wanted to be there. My current teaching schedule is a very demanding master, which must be obeyed. With regret, I know that I am missing a great opportunity to meet the very distinguished speakers who will be presenting today, as well as those of you in the audience. My best wishes to all of you for a very successful conference. Before I begin my formal remarks, can I say to you that one of my very earliest formative experiences respecting Palestine, Israel, and the occupation was thanks to UNRWA. As a young lawyer, I joined UNRWA in 1989 at the height of the first Palestinian Intifada to serve as what was known in those days as a Refugee Affairs Officer. The Refugee Affairs Officer program arose as part of the growing responsibility of UNRWA in the 1980s to provide for the legal and human rights of Palestinian refugees, as directed by the General Assembly. It was designed to monitor, intervene, and raise complaints about Israel's mistreatment of Palestinian refugees in the OPT during this uprising. For 6 months as a Refugee Affairs Officer, I traveled continuously up and down the West Bank with the other RAOs, visiting all of the 19 refugee camps on a frequent basis, trying to instill a sense among the camp inhabitants that the international community was paying attention to their well-being. As part of our duties, we would observe the regular clashes between the camp inhabitants and the Israeli army, watch rocks from one side and bullets and tear gas from the other side being exchanged, and sometimes ferry young, badly wounded Palestinians from the camps to a hospital or a health clinic. It was an unusual privilege to have been part of this unique fly-on-the-wall of history experience. More than anything, my short time with UNRWA in the West Bank instilled within me an intense personal curiosity about the peoples and the politics of the region. This would later turn into a legal scholar's professional interest in the occupation, as well as in the fate and the future of the millions of Palestinian refugees that the agency has provided such vital services for over the decades. In the short time that I have, I want to discuss 5 issues and put them in the context of international law, the occupation, and the human rights of the Palestinian refugees, keeping in mind the rights of the more than 2 million refugees in the occupied Palestinian territory. My first point has to do with the reasons for the creation of UNRWA 70 years ago. In the midst of the 1947-49 war, which led to the creation of Israel and the dispossession and exile of approximately 720,000 Palestinians, the United Nations General Assembly adopted Resolution 194 in December 1948. In paragraph 11 of the resolution, the General Assembly called for 3 things. First, the refugees who wish to return to their homes and live at peace with their neighbors should be allowed to do so at the earliest possible date. Second, for those who chose not to return home, they should receive compensation for their lost properties. And thirdly, this should all be done in accordance with international law and equity. The day before Resolution 194 was adopted, the General Assembly voted in favor of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In the Declaration, which is still the world's most noble and important proclamation on human rights, the General Assembly stated that everyone has the right to leave and return to one's country. They all have the right to nationality, and they have the right to seek asylum. These core rights of the Declaration have subsequently entered into international law. These rights apply equally to the millions of Palestinian refugees still living in exile, maintaining for them the right to return as a solemn individual right. In the context of all this, and with the refusal of Israel to allow the Palestinian refugees to return home, UNRWA was created by the United Nations in 1949. Its creation was the acknowledgement by the international community that until the terms of Resolution 194 could be satisfied, the United Nations was to continue to provide assistance to the Palestinian refugees to address their desperate plight. As the American legal scholar Susan Akram has stated, UNRWA remains the main guarantor of the survival of Palestinian refugees in the Arab host states and the main symbol of the international commitment and responsibility towards them. My second point is that the question of Palestine was and remains the most international of international conflicts. It was the international community through the United Nations which partitioned Mandate Palestine, leading to the creation of the Palestinian refugee problem. Since then, the United Nations has cared for the millions of Palestinian refugees over the past 70 years. It has overseen numerous and unsuccessful peace proposals. It has been the diplomatic cockpit when wars have broken out, and it remains the principal international political forum for the declaration of the rights and obligations that apply to the conflict and the occupation. Consequently, the only just and durable solution to the question of Palestine must be a comprehensive solution which addresses all of the outstanding issues within the framework of international law, including the rights of the 5 million Palestinian refugees. The ultimate solution, be it a genuine two-state solution, a single democratic state, or some other durable and fair settlement, has to satisfy the obligations of international law and the international consensus on this issue. This is our barometer, our fundamental guide to a morally and politically based, rights-based solution, which understands and encompasses the fact that Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs have a shared future together, and it must be based on equality and justice for all. My third point is that the same rules on the rights of refugees everywhere to a durable solution also apply equally to the Palestinian refugees. Globally, the three accepted durable solutions are: 1, voluntary return to one's home country, or 2, integration into the host country, or 3, resettlement into a third country. Whenever there will be a proposal for the final settlement of the Palestinian refugee issue, these choices must be before the refugees, and they must be able to freely decide individually which option they would prefer. This choice must be theirs and theirs alone, and cannot be abrogated by anyone else. My fourth point is to pay tribute to the valiant work performed by UNRWA over the past 7 decades. In the face of regional political instability, catastrophic wars, perpetual budget crises, a sometimes hostile international environment, and a rapidly growing refugee problem, UNRWA has accomplished an extraordinary amount in the face of all these challenges. The administration of over 700 schools, the delivery of local health care and multiple public health campaigns, the consistent upgrading of water, sanitation, and power utility services, and the employment of thousands and thousands of Palestinians. These are remarkable accomplishments by any standards. None of this is meant to airbrush the problems that are internal to UNRWA. Anyone who has worked with UNRWA or closely observed its operations will acknowledge that there's always more to be done and that there are mistakes to be addressed and answered. But when honestly evaluating the positive and the negative attributes of the agency and separate those from the rote criticisms made of UNRWA's work by those who are inherently hostile to its mandate, one can conclude that it has done a lot with very little. My fifth and final point is to push back against some of the international arguments that dissolving UNRWA would be a positive step in breaking the logjam that is preventing a final solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In my mind, nothing could be further from the political truth or the legal obligation. Pushing for the dismantlement of UNRWA as part of the solution is like saying that getting rid of food banks would solve our problems of poverty and inequality. Rather, the obligation rests with Israel and with the international community to implement the just and durable solutions for this population. These solutions must be rights-based, and they must be consistent with humanitarian and human rights obligations. The UN General Assembly annually adopts a resolution pertaining to the Palestinian refugee issue. Each resolution in recent years calls for a just solution to the issue. It is my view that such a solution must encompass the right to return for those who wish to exercise it, a right to compensation, and a right to restitution. Accompanying this must be a viable and practical plan for enabling the refugees to achieve a viable future that contributes to a broader, shared, and prosperous future for all of those in the region. Achieving this won't be easy, and it will require a multi-state, multi-level effort and plenty of lifting power by the international community. But nothing short of this will achieve the future that everybody in the region, and especially the dispossessed Palestinian refugees, deserve. Thank you very much, and my best wishes for a successful conference.
Well, that was a very terrific tour d'horizon by Michael Lynch. I'm so sorry he's not with us. I'm sure many of you would have loved to question him. We've now been allowed a few more minutes, so we have nearly 15 minutes of questions. There is a roving mic. So can I see some hands raised so I can see? Okay, let's take the two at the back there, and the one here on my right. We'll take them together, and then our panel will answer.
So I am a success story for UNRWA, so I will be always thankful. But when I left, there was a strike for the teachers in the schools in Jordan, on UNRWA schools, and there is cut funding. So there are many concerns in north of Jordan camps, Palestinian camps. So what is the UNRWA plans for the next strikes for the teachers? Because it's a huge number of students who are depending on the UNRWA schools in Jordan. So this is my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the lady in the second row to the back, I think it was. Or has that person disappeared? Okay, let's take the one. There's another one that side. Take that one.
Thank you very much for the wonderful presentations. My question is to Rachel Evers. Can you comment, if, God forbid, that UNRWA will be integrated with UNHCR, what will be the differences in the protection function of UNRWA and UNHCR for the Palestinian refugees? Thank you.
Let's take the second row here.
Hello, Khalid Nadeem, South Asia Middle East Forum. Thank you for your presentations. The Palestinian cause is a cause very close to my heart. Last year, my father died, and before he died, he said to me, he said, Khalid, I know you're trying to do all sorts of things. Which things would you put at the top of your agenda? And one of the things I put at the top of my agenda was Kashmir and the Palestinian issue. Now, I'm deeply concerned about opportunities for Palestinians under 30. I'm at the moment preparing an event on the impact of the Syrian refugee crisis on Lebanon. Whilst preparing that, I've seen some of the problems facing Palestinians, refugees. I really am disappointed in the Gulf states that they could bring a lot more to the table. I think they should institute, I'm talking about UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar. This is a message I'm sending to the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, MBS, and to the Emir of Qatar, and to Sheikh Maktoum of UAE. You really have to help your Palestinian brothers, and I think you've been forgetting them. You need to institute a Marshall Plan, and I think a Marshall Plan of a minimum of $2 billion. Also, you need to think about taking some of the young Palestinians from Jordan and Palestine into your countries. I'm not saying taking a lot, but maybe say initially 10,000 Palestinian students, the most able students, and train them and give them jobs in your respective countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll ask Rachel to respond to the first of two questions and Husam to the third.
Hello, is that working? So the first question in relation to the strikes in Jordan and the concerns in the camps and our plans in the future. So I presume you're referring to the recent strikes that took place amongst government employees in Jordan, mainly teachers from the educational part of the Ministry of Education. During that strike, UNRWA teachers remained in schools. They did not join the strike. However, the impact of the resolution of the negotiated settlement by the government of Jordan with the teachers has a direct impact on UNRWA. And the reason for that is that UNRWA traditionally, and I'm not sure, but perhaps Karen knows better than me, has aligned itself to the host government salaries in civil service. Remember, UNRWA employees do not follow the UN national staff protocols. They are underpaid compared to the UN system and traditionally been aligned with the host government civil service salaries. So when host governments undertake salary reviews and increase their salaries according to very technical pay policy reviews, UNRWA, under its own internal pay policy review system, has agreed to match so that our staff remain on the comparator with the host governments. So recently, after the conclusion of the strike in Jordan, we were faced with a strike in our HQ and our Jordan field office, with staff demanding the same comparator. And we have systems which oblige us to undertake these reviews and to ensure that in that review, none of our staff remain below the comparator. And this is something that is difficult in times of financial challenge, because of course, once you do the review, you will find certain categories of staff that may be under the comparator and require increases. And the fact is, this is the cost of labor, okay? When that happens at a time of increased financial difficulty, it's hard for us, because on the one hand, you have the moral obligation of increasing salaries according to the comparator, and on the other hand, you're facing significant financial deficits. So the two are very hard to bridge, but the moral and ethical obligation is there, and it's up to UNRWA to try and find the funding, and it's also for our donors and partners to recognize that these are pressures that we can't just continually say no to. And you have some examples across the region of this. For example, in Syria.
Sorry, I'm going to have to stop you there. But please note that you'll be able to talk to Rachel all day. And I'll say that also, if you don't mind, for the second questioner.
Yeah, I mean,
because we'd like to take one more round of questions after this. But
I'll be quick on the UNHCR question, if you like, because I think it's a relevant
It's
one.
very quick.
Yeah. I mean, this has been one of the increased attacks on UNRWA, that it should be easy to combine the two agencies. One, the two agencies were set up in the same year in 1949 for a reason. They both provide very different services. UNRWA is a direct implementer on the ground. UNHCR provides protection and assistance. There is no ability to align the two agencies.
Well, the question about the Arab world, Khalid, and thank you for your passion. Of course, we need more support from our brothers and sisters in the Arab world. But I have two main points to make here. First, the support that we really need is not to accept more Palestinians in Gulf countries. We need the Gulf countries and the Arab world to help Palestinians stay and withstand and survive. We need Arab support, political and financial, to really help our people in Jerusalem, who are the heroes, the real heroes, every single morning, every evening. And they are in need of help. And Jerusalem, of course, is our national hub and is our national capital, but Jerusalem goes beyond us. We need their help with the increasing settlements and our ability in the West Bank to actually challenge these colonial cancerous settlements. We need their help in Gaza and the end of this blockade that has been happening. We need their help in many arenas, including disengaging from the occupier economically, and that's why we have been visiting Arab capitals all along. Okay,
I'm sorry to be so mean, but I would just like to very quickly, if we've got to, well, I know we've got one question over there, and then the lady, these two ladies here, but please make them very quick questions. Okay, one.
Thank you for all the speakers. I'll try to make this quick. I'm kind of in two minds about this, so consider it like a devil's advocate question, maybe. But I'm a Palestinian refugee from Lebanon. I was born there, studied in UNRWA schools. My dad is a teacher in an UNRWA school until today. So I've very much benefited, and my entire family is still benefiting from UNRWA. But do you not think that, in a way, UNRWA makes us complacent in that there's some Palestinian refugees here, give them some basic rights, and then kind of shut up about the whole right of return thing? Do you not think that the UNRWA should be pushing more about pushing for Palestinians to go back instead of kind of just trying to let them settle in the refugee camps where they are?
Thank you. The problem with the questions is they're all so interesting we could go on for hours. But the lady in the orange scarf and the lady just in front.
Another question for Rachel, who's being somewhat deluged. I apologise for that. I was speaking with a friend in Burj al-Barajni camp in Beirut yesterday, and I'm wondering, at a time of shortfall, what the escalating economic crisis in Lebanon at the moment means. The situation in the camps is becoming severe, and they are approaching a humanitarian crisis there. So I'm wondering, where there is still salinated water, there is no fresh drinking water. They all have to buy their drinking water. So I'm just wondering what happens in an emergency situation when you're suffering as you are with the shortfall.
Hello, thank you for the speech. I am Palestinian, also refugee from Lebanon. For Mr. Husam, right to return is for us Lebanese and Palestinians in Lebanon is to all Palestine, not 67 for all Palestine, from the river till the sea. And this is from my grandparents, and I will be also inheriting it to my sons and to my daughters. Second question, you have spoken. No question, yeah. It's a comment, but I needed to say it. My question, you speak about the suffering of Palestinians, which we do all know. But how do you see the role of Palestinians? As they do have agency and they do have the power and the knowledge and the skills. How UNRWA can be using the Palestinians people, Palestinians community to move forward, especially in a very hostile environment like Lebanon, Syria, and unfortunately Jordan as well. So what's the role of the community, Palestinians people like me and the beautiful guy there from Lebanon as well? Thank you.
Okay, I think these... I'm going to take my chairman's prerogative to end on time, thanking the three speakers. But I think the second speaker already, Rachel answered that as best she possibly could. And I think you can kind of have to accept that. But I think particularly the last speaker is a very, very good moment for us to move on. And sorry, Ambassador, but it is good to have a lady who says exactly what you've been saying. Give Palestinians agency. Thank you.